Religious liberty. The House passes a bill to provide emergency disaster relief to churches and synagogues. The original Santa Claus. You might be surprised to learn St. Nicholas ties to Italy. History remembered. Lifelong conservative Lee Edwards takes us back to the time of Barry Goldwater and Joseph McCarthy. And staying flexible during Christmas. Pope Francis welcomes some unusual guests to the Vatican. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, December 27, 2017. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Churches in disaster zones could soon be allowed to receive federal aid under a new bill before Congress. Lawmakers in the House already approved the plan, but it still faces a big hurdle before it can become law.
I want to thank the chairman for including a provision in this bill that will ensure that houses of worship, churches, and synagogues get the kind of help they need on an equal basis with other nonprofits.
The House on Thursday passed an $81 billion disaster relief bill aimed at nearly doubling aid to hurricane-hit Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico, along with areas of California ravaged by wildfires. The bill also seeks to level the playing field for houses of worship seeking disaster assistance. The Federal Emergency Management Agency previously prevented religious organizations from receiving federal disaster funds.
FEMA policy was and is unfair, unjustified, and discriminatory.
Republican Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey has been pushing for the changes. He introduced similar legislation in 2013 after Superstorm Sandy and 2 times since then.
Leaders and volunteers at churches, synagogues, and other religious centers help feed, clothe, and shelter tens of thousands of victims, yet they were left out and left behind when it came to repairs of their own facilities.
So far, his bill has not passed the Senate. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer calls the House bill inadequate. He wants more help for Puerto Rico and is hoping to leverage votes on the measure into victories elsewhere.
We're not going to allow things like disaster relief go forward without discussing some of the other issues we care about.
This fall, the U.S. Bishops' Committee for Religious Liberty issued a statement supporting the legislation, calling for an end to FEMA's, quote, unfair and discriminatory policy. President Trump uses social media to attack claims that his campaign colluded with Russia. He wrote yesterday, "Dossier is bogus. Clinton campaign in D.C. funded dossier. FBI cannot, after all of this time, verify claims in dossier of Russia-Trump collusion. FBI tainted, and they use this crooked Hillary pile of garbage as the basis for going after the Trump campaign." President Obama is critical of the ways people are using social media, but he did not mention Donald Trump by name when he sat down for a radio interview with Britain's Prince Harry.
One of the dangers of the internet is that people can have entirely different realities. They can be just cocooned in information that reinforces their current biases.
Obama says the internet should allow a diversity of views that help people find common ground. The Treasury Department slaps new sanctions on 2 senior North Korean officials involved in the country's missile program. Both men are banned from making financial transactions in the U.S. Treasury officials believe North Korea is using front companies to dodge existing international sanctions. The move may make it harder for the rogue nation to pay for new weapons. For the first time since ISIS was pushed out of Mosul, Iraq, people in the war-torn city are able to hold a Christmas Mass. The head of the Chaldean Catholic Church says Mosul would never be the same without Christians. They gathered at St. Paul's Church, surrounded by security. ISIS controlled Mosul for 3 years until they were pushed out in July. Pope Francis uses his Christmas message to call for peace.
Vediamo Gesù nei bambini di tutto il mondo, dove la pace e la sicurezza sono minacciate dal pericolo di tensioni e nuovi conflitti.
The Holy Father is troubled by the winds of war blowing around the world in places like Korea, and he suggests a 2-state solution in the Middle East where Palestinians and Israelis often clash. The White House takes down a large portion of a famed magnolia tree planted by former President Andrew Jackson. The tree dates from 1835, but officials say part of the tree has become weak and poses a safety risk. Gardeners have been growing healthy offshoots of the tree to plant in its place if necessary. A new book looks at the impact of modern first ladies, including Melania Trump, and the effect they have on the country. Join us now is Andrew Oak, author of Unusual for Their Time, On the Road with America's First Ladies, Volume 2. The first book started with Martha Washington and took us through the 1800s. Volume 2 picks up with Edith Roosevelt and continues all the way to the current First Lady, Melania Trump. Andy, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
Sure. So both your books capture sort of the experience of the First Ladies and their influence. Why did you want to write about the First Ladies?
Well, I was one of the producers for C-SPAN's First Ladies Influence and Image. I was the producer that traveled to all the homes, libraries, schools, birthplaces, cemeteries. And when the series was over, I found their stories so compelling and these women so remarkable that I had to just keep talking about them and then eventually writing about them. And here we are with Volume 2.
Yeah. And each First Lady, of course, have made their own contribution to the White House, as you write about in many ways. Of course, Edith Roosevelt, the one that you write about in your new book, married to Theodore Roosevelt, you said had made some significant structural changes to the White House. Explain what she did.
Absolutely. She comes to Washington, D.C. with a very large family, 5 children, and she wants to make the White House more of a residence. She says it's a place to raise a family as well as to conduct business. So she moves the residence to the 2nd floor and creates the East Wing and the West Wing. So the physical structure of the White House and much of the interior remains today, we have to thank Edith Roosevelt for. There's a beautiful photo album that the architects gave her at the finish of the product that resides up at Sagamore Hill, their home out on Oyster Bay in Long Island.
It's fascinating. So as I mentioned, Edith Roosevelt all the way to Melania Trump in this book. Melania Trump in particular recently unveiled the Christmas decorations at the White House,
yes,
which is sort of a tradition. How long does that go back?
Well, the first Christmas tree appears in the Caroline Harrison, married to Benjamin Harrison administration. Lou Hoover has the first public Christmas tree. And then Jacqueline Kennedy has the first Christmas tree that is themed. Her theme was the Nutcracker. And every First Lady since has followed the lead of Jacqueline Kennedy and created their own theme. And there's been fantastic themes over the years. And I think Melania has done a fantastic job representing all of those themes in her nod to administrations of the past.
So interesting. Let's talk about faith. What
Sure.
role has faith played in sort of guiding First Ladies in terms of their decisions and thought process?
Well, most of the presidents and their First Ladies are Protestant. We see this throughout most of history. We know now that Melania Trump, a Catholic, is the second only Catholic First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy being the first. But some that come to mind are like Jane Pierce was highly religious. Caroline Harrison, again, she was involved in her church choir. These women have been very involved in their churches over the time. In fact, the Wilsons, both President Wilson and his first wife, Ellen Wilson, their fathers were ministers, were Protestant ministers in Georgia where they met, and both of their parents, both of their fathers, their minister fathers, married them in Woodrow Wilson's first marriage to Ellen Wilson.
It's fascinating to think about all the history there, how important religion has played over the years.
Extremely.
In history. Yeah. You write in the book how Laura Bush in particular is your favorite First Lady in the 21st century. What is it about her that you like?
Well, Laura Bush and her husband arguably started out as domestic policy President and First Lady. She was following her mother-in-law, Barbara Bush's footsteps to teach children to read. She's a librarian by trade. And then on 9/11, the world changed. It changed for everyone. But Laura Bush had to do it on the global stage. And she was not an internationally well-traveled woman before that. She was going to countries that maybe previously she couldn't, or I couldn't, or anyone could have found on a map or spelled or all that. And she had to go out and she championed for women's rights and women's education the world over and became one of the most traveled First Ladies in history, promoting this women's empowerment and women's freedom and education agenda. And she just did it seamlessly. It was remarkable to watch.
Sure, I know she has had so much influence on so many others, and of course, these First Ladies people have admired for years. Andy Oak, author of Unusual for Their Time, thanks so much for talking with us about them.
Thanks for having me back, Wyatt.
Construction has halted on a church destroyed in the September 11th terror attack at the World Trade Center. Reports say St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church is more than $20 million over budget. The Catholic Archdiocese of Boston is among the donors, along with the Italian city of Bari, where the relics of St. Nicholas reside. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley explores those Italian roots to the real Santa Claus, something many people may not know about St. Nicholas.
His beard is dark and he's not as round, but behold, the original Santa Claus. He is St. Nicholas of Bari, and the people here are paying him homage with processions, masses, and mouth-watering street food. Yet he wasn't a native of this city in southern Italy.
St. Nicholas was born in Myra in Turkey at the end of the 3rd century. And then he was ordained a bishop. And he was from a well-to-do family. And he always defended the doctrine of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. He was known for his benevolence, his goodness, and his kindness.
So how did a bishop from Turkey become the patron saint of an Italian city? According to tradition, his relics were rescued in the 11th century and Italian merchants moved them to Bari. The townspeople made good on a promise to build a church in his honor, and eventually St. Nicholas was declared the patron saint. It took 5 centuries for him to become associated with Santa Claus.
The Dutch had a tradition of celebrating St. Nicholas's feast day on December 6th and called him Sinterklaas. So this combination of Kris Kringle and Sinterklaas came together, and what we understand is Santa Claus.
Santa Claus is famous all over the world, but St. Nicholas has his own following in many countries as well.
He's one of the most revered saints, not just for Catholics, but even within the Russian Orthodox tradition. So much so that last summer, the saint's relics, long been kept in Bari, were loaned for 2 months to Russia, and 2 million Russians waited in line to see them. In Rome, Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, Christmas surprise. A Pennsylvania town witnesses a record-breaking winter. And fine art. Historian Jim Sullivan analyzes a well-known sculptor's 15th century nativity scene. People in Erie, Pennsylvania received more than a white Christmas. They got hammered with record-breaking snowfall, including 34 inches on Monday and another 24 inches yesterday. That's roughly 5 feet of snow. The city has declared a snow emergency. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. A political advisor asked his candidate to show more personality and is nearly fired. It sounds far-fetched in this day and age of sound bites and social media, but historically, it really happened. Lauren Ashburn sits down with a leading conservative author to talk about a candidate who wanted to run on principles.
Lee Edwards joins us now in studio. Welcome back to the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
Goldwater. Let's talk about Barry Goldwater. In your book, you talk about working on his presidential campaign. He ran in 1964 and lost, much to the chagrin of many, many conservatives. You say it transformed your life. How so?
Well, he gave me an opportunity to be in the major leagues. I had been somebody who had not exactly been in the front lines. And here was an opportunity to work in a presidential campaign for somebody whom I admired so much. He was a hero of mine because he was for limiting government, and he was for winning the war, the Cold War, and defeating communism. So here was somebody that I so devoutly, really devoutly admired. And here was my chance. And he did not let me down, because he said over and over again that this is going to be a campaign of principles and not of personalities. And when I tried to do a little bit of Madison Avenue type of approach of talking about Barry Goldwater, he said no. This big hand came out and he said, I will kick you out of this campaign if you try that.
Yes, sir. Your father worked for the Tribune, Chicago Tribune here in Washington, D.C., and covered the era of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Has the media changed from your father's day of covering communism?
Well, I think it has, in this sense that there was a very clear and present danger back in those days. And so we were in the middle of the Cold War. And so someone like Joe McCarthy, who had enormous support, and by the way, from literally millions of Catholics who wrote in to him and were sending in prayer cards and rosaries. I was at his office one day and saw them there. But at the same time, what we have today is a much different threat. And it seems to me it's just as serious as the communist threat was some 40 or 50 years ago.
And what is that?
And that is radical jihadism. They really do want to destroy us and our culture and our faith. And you know, the Heritage Foundation has done a report in which they found that 100 terrorist acts have been prevented since 9/11 through various measures that we've taken in this country. Well, this is a serious and continuing problem, and we can't just ignore it.
Is your mistrust of communists, you said that in Paris, a long time ago after leaving the Army that you left because, quote, my dormant anti-communism came alive. Is your mistrust of communism shaped at all by your Catholic faith?
Oh, no question about it, because we know if you read the Communist Manifesto that one of the targets of communists and communism is the church. And of course, the Catholic Church is number one on their list of enemies. We can see that, of course, also with the attempted assassination of John Paul II, which we now know was not just done by a Bulgarian, but was in fact orchestrated by the GRU, the military arm of the KGB.
For 20 years, you worked to build the Victims of Communism Memorial here in Washington. What challenges did you come across?
Well, you must negotiate 24 steps to build a memorial in Washington, D.C. 24.
Okay, 24. I don't think we have time for all 24, but give us an inkling.
Including the design has to be approved, the site has to be approved, you have to raise the money yourself, you have to get the permission from 5 different commissions, 3 federal, 1 city,
okay.
and 1 neighborhood commission.
This is worse than building an addition on your house, I see.
Indeed, and just as long. The average time to build a memorial in Washington is 14 years. Which is what it took us to do that. But finally, in June of 2007, with President George W. Bush there, we accepted it. He accepted it on behalf of the American people.
And where is it exactly?
It's at the corner of Massachusetts and New Jersey Avenue, just 2 blocks
from our studios.
From here.
It's
yes.
not very far.
You can walk there in 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, if people are traveling to Washington, D.C., we hope that they will stop there. And remember Lee Edwards, the author of Just Right, A Pursuit of Liberty. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Up next, Life of a Saint, what we're learning about Pope John Paul II from his biographer, George Weigel. And the circus comes to town. Pope Francis welcomes some unusual guests to his weekly audience at the Vatican. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. We're learning more about the life of Pope John Paul II through his biographer. George Weigel recently talked to Rome correspondent Juliet Lindley about his new book.
Professor George Weigel, papal biographer, welcome to the Vatican. You're here to present your new book, Lessons in Hope. Now, we all know you from your previous one, Witness to Hope. Tell us what's new about this one.
This is completely different from the 2 volumes of my John Paul II biography, Witness to Hope, and The End and the Beginning. That was scholarly biography, heavily footnoted. This book doesn't have a single footnote in it. It's an album of memories. It's full of stories of our conversations over 12 years and of the unexpected and strange way in which I became a papal biographer.
What is the genesis of your friendship with the late pontiff? How did all of this come about that you've become so intimate with him, you've written books about him?
We had our first serious conversation in 1992 when I was publishing the book, The Final Revolution, on the Church's role in the collapse of communism in Europe. And the conversation simply snowballed from there on, and in 1995 I had this madcap idea of writing his biography and the history of his pontificate, and he agreed to cooperate with that. I think the relationship deepened and intensified over a dozen years. We went through some difficult times together, including the sex abuse crisis of 2002, his own intense suffering in 2003 and 2004. But throughout all of that, he was teaching all of us the title of this book, Lessons in Hope, because he conformed that suffering to Christ and the cross.
Your book is very anecdotal. Can you tell us some of the most salient anecdotes you have of Pope St. John Paul II?
We had a lot of joking back and forth. There was a fair amount of banter in our conversations, and I repeat some of those in the book. I think the most touching was our last encounter on December 15th, 2004. My father had died 2 months earlier. The Pope had sent a telegram for the funeral. But he was in pretty tough shape then himself, yet the first thing he said to me when I walked into the papal apartment was, "How is your mother doing?" Pastor's memory to the end. Very, very touching and something I'll keep with me the rest of my life.
Wow, absolutely. How is John Paul II's legacy still relevant nowadays?
I think if you go around the world church, whether that's in Europe or Africa or Asia or the Americas, the living parts of the church are the parts that have embraced the magisterium of John Paul II and his vision of a church of evangelical Catholicism in full. Those are the living parts of the church, and his legacy lives through those people.
Professor George Weigel, thank you so much for joining us here in Rome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks, Juliet, for that interview. This week, Catholics continue to reflect on the birth of our Lord through the nativity scene. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with the first one in 1223. Later in the 15th century, a well-known sculptor created his own unique Christmas creche. Joining us now is Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, who could tell us a little bit more. So, Jim, the artist is Luca della Robbia. What is he famous for?
Wyatt, Luca della Robbia was really one of the great artists of the Italian Renaissance. He was the grandfather, the patriarch, if you will, of an entire family of artists, 3 generations. He passed on his artistic skills to his nephew, Andrea della Robbia, who in turn passed on the family tradition to his son, Giovanni della Robbia. But Luca della Robbia was a true innovator. Why? Because he combined the best of painting with the best of sculpture in his signature glazed terracotta sculptures. And we have this beautiful example of the Nativity that we're about to see.
Sure, let's take a closer look at that. Like you said, one of his terracotta sculptures is at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington. So how is this different than other nativity scenes?
Sure. What's unique about this, again, is that signature work of the della Robbia family. White glazed figures against a deep blue background, framed by garlands of fruit and flowers. But this nativity scene is so beautiful because we see the baby Jesus lying on a bed of grass. He is humble and poor, with only the 2 animals close to him. You can almost feel the animals' breath warming the stable of Bethlehem. A choir of angels above singing the praises of God at the coming of Christ into the world. But really it's Mary and Joseph who draw us into this humble scene. Because why? They are kneeling in adoration before the baby Jesus. And they're inviting us to do the same, to join, as it were, in this hymn of praise to God. I like to think of this nativity scene as a visual hymn that invites us to sing, "O come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord."
Sure, you mentioned the glaze here. The sculpture is pretty shiny. Tell me a little bit about this technique and how often he would use this.
Sure. This was the family secret, as it were, of the della Robbias. Their glaze recipes that would create these shiny terracotta sculptures were kept a family secret. The clay bed where they were sourcing their materials of clay and glazes were also a family secret. But what's really innovative is that these shiny sculptures endured for 500 years. And what we do know about the della Robbias was that they were devout Catholics. And we see how their faith really inspired these beautiful works of art.
It is so fascinating to hear so much about it, and obviously their techniques and their unique ways of depicting the nativity scene. Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, thanks so much for telling us about it.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Finally tonight, the Pope's weekly audience includes a few tricks that were a real treat for the Holy Father. Members of the Golden Circus performed for the Pontiff. Among them were acrobats and a strongman. The show has become part of the Vatican's regular holiday festivities. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.